Good evening, everyone. I'm Joe Abadi. You're watching Vintage Motocross Q&A. Before we begin tonight's show, I want to thank some of our sponsors. In fact, I want to thank all of our sponsors. Motion Pro, Vinco, Preston Petty Products, Racer X, Full Circle Racing, Replica Motorcycle Parts, and the International Motocross Museum. Tonight, my guest is Keith Geisner. Keith, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Joe. It's an honor to be here.
Keith, you have been the author of two books, Finding Number 49, which was a book about the kind of forgotten Harley-Davidson motocross team that happened back in the 70s. And you have a new book that's recently been released. Well, not so recently, but it is a new book. It's called Discovering 6 Days. And, well, I've got a lot of questions, Keith, and I guess really the first one, so I could get you involved and get the crowd involved a little bit. Let's talk about your introduction into motorsports. Where did that all happen? Tell me about the early years of Keith Geisner and motorcycles.
So my early years is similar to everybody else's, but I started on four wheels. My dad drag raced, so we had go-karts growing up and playing with. But when my brothers graduated up to dirt bikes, I had a mini bike with a Briggs & Stratton motor. So my brothers were twins and they were 4 years older than me. So I was always trying to play catch up with them. But it wasn't until I was 10 until my dad bought me a new Suzuki DR100 and they had matching DR125s. And we lived out surrounded by farmland. So we had endless miles of trail riding and it was a kid's dream.
You're out in the Midwest, Keith. Where are you exactly? St. Louis?
We're an hour south of St. Louis in St. Genevieve, Missouri. It's known as the first city west of the Mississippi. It's a historic town and now a national park, the downtown section of it, yes.
Okay.
And I grew up about 5 miles out of town.
Go ahead.
I grew up about 5 miles out of town, so we were in the thick of the farm riding land as far as you can see. So
okay, I want to remind people too to keep sharing the show. We give away a sticker sheet like this every week, compliments of vinco.com. Keep sharing the show, and tomorrow on the Vintage Motocross Q&A page we will have the winner of that sticker sheet. So you get involved with the with the dirt bike and your brothers. You had an uncle who was involved in a Grand Prix in St. Joe's. What happened there?
So there's a park close to St. Genevieve called St. Joe Park. It's an off-road riding area. Right. They would have once a year, they would have a 100-mile Grand Prix race. But my uncle would also compete in enduros and hare scrambles throughout the year as well. But we always heard the stories of the Grand Prix race and the year he took second and while crossing the finish line with a flat front tire and the tube hanging out. But the bike that he raced that really caught my attention was an 83 XR 500. And that was the year they kind of gave it a color change, the blue seat, the orange and the yellow background. Something about that bike just popped. So any chance I had a chance of climbing on that bike and sitting on it, I took advantage of it. And it just fueled my desire to go trail riding.
Okay. And you weren't big enough to ride that bike at that time?
No.
Okay.
No, I was, years away from hopping on a bike that size. But I tore up that little DR100. I put a lot of trail miles on it and visualizing, racing through the woods like my uncle would have. But it wasn't until I turned 16 before I ever got to even go out to St. Joe Park and experience the trails and what it was all about.
Okay. And obviously your dad was behind you at that point, because not all of us go riding and racing motorcycles with the blessing of our parents.
No, well, I was lucky enough. My brothers broke the ice for me. So anything I did couldn't have been as worse as what they already did. And I was mostly trail riding at that point. Me and my friends, we load up our vehicles and go out there and ride all day. At the start of both books, I kind of give a summary of my early childhood or why am I writing this book, and
Yeah.
St. Joe was a big part of the Discovering Six Day book. And I started off racing in hare scrambles not until after college. So I was 22 years old before I even did any kind of competitive racing at an amateur level, of course. But I would say for 13 years straight, I would try to race anywhere from 3 to 5 hare scrambles a year. And I really didn't get into vintage racing until around 2000.
Yeah, that was kind of my next question, Keith, was for many of us, there was a gap between when we raced in, let's say, the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, to when we all rediscovered vintage motocross and vintage enduros and things like that. And many of us had a gap in between those years. Did you have that, or did you continue riding your more modern bike and then discovered the vintage stuff?
Well, I kind of did them both at the same time. More modern hare scrambles than vintage. I was kind of slow at getting starting in vintage. Not until 2008 that I finally sit down and put together a vintage specific dirt bike to race on. And I was fond of 4-strokes. So I found an old XL 350 chassis or carcass and did all the tricks and mods you can find on them on the internet. And in 2008, that's when I started competing on that bike. And I basically, those 4-strokes, you could feed them sand and they would run on. And I basically raced that bike up until today. I took it down to Daytona back in 2022, where I took second in my class during their vintage motocross race. So,
it's funny, Keith. You're one of the few people that I've not only that I've interviewed, but you're one of the few people that I know that continued riding throughout his youth, and then discovered vintage motocross, and then went on from there. We usually have, this gap that's in there, or you've got guys that maybe didn't have motocross bikes at all and didn't get a chance to get on the track until they were maybe in their mid 30s, late 30s when they discovered vintage motocross.
Well, speaking of gaps, I'm experiencing that now, Joe. See, I didn't get married until I was 29, and we held off. Kids were not in our plans. So it wasn't until 2015 did we first have my son Rex, and then 2017 we had my daughter Eden. Rex is 8 now, Eden is 6, and they're taking up a lot of my time, which is great. Sure. But I am experiencing my gap right now.
Okay, Keith. The first, I want to give the viewers a little bit more of a background on the first book that you had written, Finding Number 49. It's a really great book, and if you're a vintage motocross guy or a motocross guy or just a Harley Davidson enthusiast in general, you will find this book absolutely fascinating. It was a finalist in an independent contest of some type. Keith, tell me what it was a finalist in. How did that all shake out?
Well, so one of my first editors that I used for the book reached out to me and said, you need to enter that book into a few book shows or competitions. She gave me the name of 2. So I said, what the heck? And I sent them in. I didn't place high enough in one of them, but the Indie Excellence Book Publishing Award, I was a finalist in. And, our hobby sport is kind of a niche. So yeah. I actually was a runner-up to a pickleball book in the sports category.
Okay. So,
and pickleball is pretty popular. So to take runner-up to that, I'm happy with that.
All right. While we're talking about it, Full Circle Racing got a great special going on, $775, 18 and 19-inch and 21-inch rims. Send your hubs up to Tom McAllister. He'll bead blast them, powder coat them, give you new nipples, spokes, lacing and truing. $775. That's at Full Circle Racing while that special still lasts. Keith, respectfully, you blew the dust off of a lot of old careers when you wrote Finding Number 49. The world rediscovered Don Kadalski, Rex Staton. I think Rich Eierstedt had already passed on by the time you had written that book. But of course, Marty Tripes. What kind of response were you getting from Kadalski and Tripes and Staton when you were writing this book? I mean, I'm sure you had to contact them when you were trying to put it together.
Correct. I did have to reach out numerous times to make sure I got their story straight. To be honest, I didn't get to speak to Marty until I already had the manuscript completed. But I got to meet him there at the Trailblazer banquet back in 2019.
Yeah.
When Rex was inducted. Rex surprised me one day after emailing him and reaching out to him on Facebook. I'd sent him photos of my progress, and he just out of the blue called me one day, and I was beside myself. And so anytime I needed something answered by him, he was always there to text me back or send me an IM.
Yeah.
Great guy. And Kodowski, he was kind of hard to find at first, but once I found him and he kind of knew what I was doing, he was an open book. And but I think since the book has been published, he's really, come out and enjoying his past again.
Yeah. I mean, thanks to you, we had him on this show and he gave a great interview.
Yeah. And really, I was towards the end of my research and writing the book, I was getting more enjoyment out of reconnecting these team members and kind of bringing joy to them, knowing that their past is still remembered. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I got a great feeling just out of reaching out to them, the team members, and just talking about their past and explaining what I found and connecting them with each other. Don and Tom Boleyn haven't talked since the 78 MX season. Marty's asked for Tom's number. Rex has asked for Tom's number. And it's things like that. And seeing Tom's face when he ran into Scott Burnsworth at the 76th annual Trailblazer banquet, it was priceless. So it's really making this whole journey very rewarding.
Keith, you found the motorcycle, the number 49 factory Harley. You found that bike. That was the inspiration to write the book, or was the book something in the back of your mind to begin with? Take us down that path a bit.
No, the book wasn't even a thought.
Okay.
My goal was I need to find out what I have here. So, just not until towards the end, when the unimaginable was actually taking place as far as the rear fender showing up that I needed, the factory rear fender, the pieces that I was able to trace down and figure out what they used to make the bike complete. Mm-hmm. And I mean, finding out, Steve Storrs pointing out the frame number, enlightening me on that, and everything with how things fell in place, how the timing fell in place to be at the Harley Museum on the 40th anniversary of the same week Don won the overall win for Harley motocross. After that visit, I'm like, I have to tell this story. These people are part of the history of this bike. The Nichols brothers. I didn't know Nichols brothers before I found that Jay Clark that I worked with had the program from the 1978 Redbud race. Yeah. And sure enough, he was the key ingredient to figuring out how that bike made it to Missouri. Yeah. And he's the only rider to ever ride the water-cooled bike in a national event. So
it's a fascinating book. And for anybody who's into vintage motocross, yes. If you're into the history of motocross, yes. If you are just a Harley Davidson enthusiast, and many Harley guys, I've met a lot of Harley guys over the years, they never had any idea that there was a motocross team that was put together by Harley for that brief period, and that it had some incredible history. And it was just something very, very special that just about anybody, we all can enjoy that. That's for sure. So, Keith, what I'm going to do is we're going to take a little break. We're going to hear from one of our sponsors. When we come back, we'll talk about your new book, Discovering 6 Days, okay?
Sounds good.
We'll be right back with more Keith Geisner.
Vinco, who already has a full line of vintage parts, now has air shocks that are an exact duplicate of the original air shocks so popular in the late 70s. So whether you're looking to build a full racer or museum showpiece, these shocks will give you that incredible 70s look and improve your bike's performance. These new air shocks are fully rebuildable with Vinco rebuild kits, and all shocks are hand assembled in the USA with all new components. Every component is brand new. Just like the originals, our air shocks are adjustable with 2 chambers, high and low pressure, giving you tremendous flexibility for settings of your bike suspension. The Vinco air shocks come fully assembled and ready for installation. Just add air or nitrogen. The kits include the manual and spacers. Visit Vinco.com to check out the air shocks and all that Vinco has to offer to help you get back on track and to keep that ride going.
Vinco special this week is 1979 through 1985 Suzuki RM250 clutch kit, $89.95. That comes with 4 plates, 5 friction plates, and 6 springs. I just got the special just before we started to record the show. I didn't have a chance to put the picture up, and that's why you're not seeing the picture of the Vinco special this week. But if you go to our page tomorrow, we will have a picture of the Vinco special. My guest tonight is Keith Geisner. We were just talking about Finding Number 49, the incredible book about the Harley-Davidson motocross team from the 70s. And Keith went on with his prolific pen to write another book, and it is called Discovering 6 Days. And this is a very, very interesting, I mean, the title alone, a story about a motorcycle, a friendship, and the International 6-Day Trials history. Keith, first of all, a lot of people who watch this show on Facebook and YouTube, and hopefully they'll keep sharing it, but that's not important right now. All of our people who watch from Facebook and YouTube are very, very familiar with International 6-Day Trials, motocross, and different types of racing. We're on 2 channels in Long Island, New York, LGTV, cable access channels. A lot of people have been watching our interviews and learning more about the things that we do here at Vintage Motocross Q&A, but they may not know about what the ISDT is, what International 6-Day Trials actually is. Give us a brief synopsis of what happens. Why is it called that? How long has this type of competition been in existence?
Well, it kind of started back in 1903 in Great Britain, where I wrote down here somewhere, an automobile club, it was like a endurance reliability test for on-road, off-road vehicles. And it consisted of hundreds of miles over anywhere from up to 6 days. Well, not until like 1913 did they actually change it to the International 6-Day Trials. And it changed a lot through the years. But what it basically is, it's a race hosted by once a year by numerous countries, Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, Italy, and the United States. And it's what I try to explain to people is that aren't familiar is it's a 6-day race. The rider rides over 200 miles a day. That's 1,200 miles in the week.
Yeah.
Only they can fix their bike. Only they have a small amount of time to do maintenance on their bike to last the full 6 days. And I think when I tell them that, they kind of get the picture that that's a pretty grueling race.
Oh, yeah.
What attracted me to this, and even though I wasn't an expert, I'm still not, but on International 6-Day, when I was doing hare scrambles, at the most, I would probably do 60 miles in a race. And I was dead at the end of 2.5 hours. I mean, I was throwing up, dehydrated. And here these guys are, it's just, to me, they're heroes. They're supermen, superwomen. I don't know how they do it.
And Keith, there are other countries involved too. So it's like an Olympic of an off-road motorcycle race.
That's true. They kind of coined it the Olympics of off-road motorcycle racing. So, and I'll chime in real quick that this is the 50th year anniversary from the first 1973 race held in the United States. And the Leroy Winters reunion ride is this weekend to celebrate that up in Massachusetts, I believe.
Who was Leroy Winters, Keith?
Leroy Winters, and I probably won't do him justice, but he was from Arkansas, and he was one of the first off-road legends that compete in the ISTT and do well. And he was up there with the Pentons and helping them get started, and actually on the Penton team with Dave Mungenass in the late 60s. So it was his idea, I believe, to get this reunion ride started. And it started at his location in Arkansas.
Okay.
And he has since passed away, but they keep it going. And I believe Jeff DeBell is a big supporter of it and keeps the annual ride going.
Keith, tell me this. The inspiration for your first book, Finding Number 49, was a motorcycle. Discovering 6 Days, was there a motorcycle involved in that one too, or just it's a story you wanted to follow?
No, it's definitely around a motorcycle. So that's a common theme with my books. There's a motorcycle involved. There's a preservation involved. So I kind of tell the story around the bike.
Does this bike right here have something? Does this bike right here have something to do with it?
That bike started it, yes.
Okay.
That's a 1976 Husqvarna 360 WR that was ridden by Jim Simmons in the 1976 Austria ISDT.
Is that Jim Simmons there with you?
That's Jim on the left and his buddy Stan Rubottom on the right.
Right. Okay. Okay. Because I do know you mentioned his name quite a bit throughout the book, Jim Simmons. So is that a bike that you found and much like on the 49 book started to research? So you found the bike first?
Well, the common theme with the Finding 49 book, it was all about timing and how things just fell in place, all in time for the 40th anniversary showing. I came across that bike while looking at a YZ400 a person had for sale. He was able to deliver to my house, and the more we talked, and I showed him the Harley, he brought up the fact that he had a Jim Simmons ISDT bike. And at that time, I've heard of the ISDT, the 6 day. I didn't know much about it. But what really bothered me was he was talking about this Jim Simmons character who lived 30 minutes from me, and I'd never heard of him. So in my area, you have Dave Mungenass, you have Gary Surdike. Those are the two big names you think of when you think of the St. Louis, Festus, and Flat River areas.
Right.
But the timing was, so we made a deal on the bike, and I first confirmed it through Jeff DeBell, who I mentioned earlier. He got me in touch with Jim Simmons' daughter, who gave me his cell number. And based on what the seller told me, Jim confirmed how it got to him. And so I made the deal on the bike. And at the same time, I was finishing up number 49, and I was stuck on what type of front brake cable guide the team used that's mounted on the front fender. Mm-hmm. And I'm scourging hardware stores and sending pictures to the team members. You know, it was hard for them to remember something 40 years ago.
Sure. And
I got the bike back at the shop, and I walked past it for 2 weeks, and finally I just looked at it and it clicked. On those Husqvarnas, they have these little rubber brackets that hold the air box and the rear fender to the frame.
Yes.
That is what the Harley team used on the MX 250s and 360s, because Tom Boleyn was a factory Husky mechanic, and he brought a lot of tricks with him to the Harley team. And they confirmed all my findings. So the timing with me finding the Husqvarna Jim Simmons bike helped me complete the Harley on time and accurately. So that
is this the bike before you restored it?
Yes. So 2 months or about a month after I reached out to Jim, he was on a fishing trip down in Arkansas.
Right.
the day before deer season in Missouri, I was able to go down there and spend the afternoon with Jim and interview him about the bike and his time racing. And during that time, I learned who he raced with. There was people he knew that I knew of that or had a common relationship with. Jim, I mean, I don't know. It was weird talking to Jim because it's like I can see myself being his friend back in the day, riding with him. Yeah. He's just a jokester. He's a joy to talk with. But listen to his stories, you were really at awe at what all he's been through.
Now, on the back of your book here, Keith, it mentions something about some unusual relationships, like Jim Simmons, and he raced with some other people, but they were actually friends as children. Is that correct?
That's correct. The other character to the book that I learned about was Stan Rubottom. Stan and Jim grew up together in Esther, Missouri, which is right next to Farmington. There they are holding.
Is this them? Huh? Is this them?
Yeah, that's Jim and Stan. And they grew up, they went to high school together. They were the top athletes in baseball, basketball, and
they look like they're holding water skis. What is that? The little baby water ski.
So for fun, they would ski on the weekends. Before they started riding, they were out skiing and doing whatever. And then this campground area over where they were skiing, they started seeing these little motorcycles pop up. So that caught their interest, and they started out on like little Yamaha 100s. Well, they knew after a week they were too small. So they graduated to a 125. And then it wasn't until like a year later, they went up to Dave Munganast Honda and got their first Husqvarnas. And that's when they learned about the ISDT.
Okay.
And so a year later, in 1970, they started competing in national enduros to get the points to become A riders and compete in these 2-day races. So Jim and Stan, they're friends. They're both 81 this year, still friends. And they've been together their whole life. And so they were both school teachers early on. But when the riding took more of their time from teaching, they quit teaching, became carpet installers so they could still do manual labor and stay in shape, but be able to take off whenever they wanted to. So from 73 through 78, they competed in the U.S. 2-day trials, which in the U.S., to qualify for the international 6 days, you had to participate in 6 or 7 2-day trials competitions. Like they're anywhere from 100 to 200 miles a day, a Saturday and Sunday race from New Jersey to Washington. They traveled the whole U.S. If you scored, 4 gold medals, 4 or 5, you're pretty much guaranteed to make the U.S. team. And the U.S. team took around 30 to 40 riders each year. Jim and Stan were both members of the first-year Rokon race team. And Tom Clark, who is also a pretty well-known rider, dirt tracker back in the day, AMA employee, Rokon VP that helped the development of the Rokon enduro bikes and race bikes, knew Jim and Stan because he lived, not only did he live in Ohio when he worked for the AMA, but he lived in Potosi, Missouri as well.
Okay.
And
is this one of the bikes or both of the bikes that we're talking about as far as the Rokons, Keith? Those
are both Rokon bikes, and those are both the bikes Jim raced in 1975. The bike on the left was his 2-day qualifier bike. He qualified on that bike. The bike on the right is the one he raced in the Isle of Man, 6-day in 1975.
Okay. And did you wind up finding those? Well, obviously, I mean, you have a picture of them with the bikes right there. Is that another bike that is involved in this book that you now have possession of that you're going to restore?
That's the plan. I teased the Isle of Man bike at the end of my Discovering the Six Day book. That came up when I was finishing the book. A couple of friends from Washington reached out to me. They were snowmobile enthusiasts, and they were able to find the numbers on that bike and trace it back to Jim, and that he raced it in the Isle of Man. They found out how it got back to the United States, and they found out that I was friends with Jim through my book, Finding Number 49. So at first, I didn't know I was going to end up with it. I didn't know what he was wanting to do with it. I was open to purchase it if it was available. Mm-hmm. And after about a year, he decided he thought I was the right candidate for it since I was friends with Jim. So I did make a deal, and it's in my possession now. The 2-day qualifier bike, though, that's another story, which I want to save for the next book, whatever that may be.
Okay.
But the more complete bike on the left, there's a couple Rokon Facebook groups, and pictures of that bike popped up, and there was clues on that bike that helped me trace it back to Jim. And then some local help led me to a guy who owned it when it was Jim owned it, or he bought it from Jim originally. And I was able to trace it back to how it made it to Pennsylvania.
How did that happen? Because wasn't it overseas or something?
Well, the Isle of Man bike was overseas. The one missing the motor in that picture was in Great Britain, and there was a military person there watching the race. And at the end of the 6th day, the Rokon team was giving the bikes away, or at least Jim's. This service person took the bike, put it on the ship, and brought it back to around North Carolina or South Carolina. From there, it made its way up to Minnesota, where a snowmobile enthusiast got the bike. And luckily, when I got it, it didn't have the pipe or the seat, and he still had that in his garage. I did have to source a motor for it, but I'm pretty close to having all the pieces I need to start a preservation on it. But that's the plan. Those 2 bikes will be the center point to a future book, which I'm debating. It'll focus around Rokon racing history, basically.
Okay. In the book, Discovering Number 49, you wrote something, and you know what? You may have covered it just now in the last 15 minutes or so, but I wanted to read it to you and ask you exactly what is it that was, as you say here, cracked wide open. And I quote, this is from Keith Geisner. "I'm fortunate to live in an area in the Midwest and Missouri specifically that was historically a hotbed for big-time international 6-day trials riders with the last names such as Mungenast, Surdijk, Schmidt, etc. And to name them would have been impossible prior to the fall of 2017. I probably wouldn't have been able to name half of them until a lucky discovery in October of 2017. And that's when the world cracked wide open for me. What was the lucky discovery?
It was Jim's Husqvarna.
Okay.
Once I got that bike, I went on a deep dive into ISDT history and tracking down any information I can find on Jim, where that bike was all raced, and his history, Stan's history, any photos of the bike. And luckily, some of his friends were there on vacation and took a lot of photos, which really helped in the preservation of the bike.
Right.
But while the research and talking to Jim, I learned that Ed Schmidt is a well-known rider in international 6-day history. He took over the Husqvarna distributorship from John Penton when it moved to Nashville, Tennessee. And Ed was the key person who hooked Jim up with the Husqvarna that I found. Ed would also go on to work with Dave Mungenast.
Okay.
But Tom Clark was another person that he was the person who got Jim and Stan the Rokon ride in '73. And come to find out, I met Tom before, but didn't realize it. I sold him a 75 TNT Can-Am 175. And they were
Okay.
telling me he was going to ride it in a 6-day reunion ride. It didn't dawn on me at the time. This was probably 10 years earlier. But, it's a shame I didn't know about it more then. But the fact that I got to read him or got to meet him and saw him a bike, and even though I didn't know much about Tom at the time, but he was a very fascinating guy.
Yeah. Keith, I've got to take a little break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about a rather interesting picture, and I would like you to tell the folks what's going on with it. It's really kind of funny, and I want to know more about it too. We'll be right back with more Keith Geisner. Thank you, Terry Good and the International Motocross Museum. To get some beautiful swag from the International Motocross Museum, go to the internationalmotocrossmuseum.org. It is a 501(c) not-for-profit organization. Anything you purchase is tax deductible. Keith, we've got a picture here. This is funny because we got Lars Larson, who is a Swedish transplant to America, wearing a sombrero and a Viva Mexico shirt. Who are the other two guys? Why are they representing Mexico in probably an international 6-day trials event?
So the middle guy, the tall guy, is Jim Simmons.
Right.
And the guy next to Jim is Fred Cameron.
Okay.
On my first visit to Jim, he surprised me by pulling out his Mexico ISDT helmet, and that's the first year Mexico entered the competition, all because of Lars. Lars, from what Lars told me, he had a pretty busy year. He couldn't make some of the qualifiers, so in turn he couldn't go to the ISDT, which was in Sweden, and that was a must for him. He had to go back to his home country to compete. So He took it upon himself to reach out to the Mexico government, and with some fake addresses and passports, he's able to make Team Mexico. He knew Jim didn't make the ISDT that year. He just missed out riding a sponsored Yamaha. So, and he knew Jim through the years. So he reached out to Jim. Jim said he was game. He knew Fred Cameron from California. They both camped together and hung out.
Right.
And so that formed the first Mexico ISDT team, and which is the helmet.
How did they do that year? Do you know?
Lars received gold, and Jim and Fred were silver, I believe.
On Huskies?
Jim raced a 77 IT 400 or a 77 YZ 400 with an IT tank, an oversized tank. Donated to him by a local dealership who I talk about in the book as well, Carl Donaldson. I'm not for sure offhand what Lars, it's mentioned in the book, but they did fairly well. And apparently Jim was on a gold pace, and especially after the last motocross competition, but they threw the competition out because of the rain. And so because of that, he got knocked back down to a silver medal. And that was for the 1978 ISDT. That was the last year Jim competed.
You had to do a lot of research for the Discovering 6 Days book. were most of the guys still alive? I mean, of course, you had Simmons there, and you had a few other guys. But did you reach out for some families where the people were no longer alive, and how did you deal with that?
Well, Tom Clark was gone. He passed away, I believe, back in 06 or 09. Right. Most of his information came from Jim himself and some local people who knew Tom. So there's a short section on Tom in there. Everybody else was around to talk to. We'd have a phone conversation, like Chris Carter. He was probably the furthest person away. I reached out to him in California because during my investigation and talking with Stan and Jim, every magazine they had Chris on the back. Yeah. And Kevin Haggerty, another local person who worked for Yamaha, talked about Chris a lot. Chris raced the prototype IT in the 1975 two-day qualifier in Potosi, Missouri. So everybody was still around, and it was either an in-person interview I did with Kevin. It was probably a 3-hour interview. That guy is just full of information and history. Everybody else, I'd probably emailed them a list of questions, and they would fill it out for me and send it back. But I probably had maybe a year to year and a half preservation on Jim's bike, and then another 2 years of writing, investigating, and editing before it was released. So I found it in October 2017. The book came out in December of 2020.
Chris Carter and Motion Bro have been a longtime sponsor of Vintage Motocross Q&A. Don't forget to visit their website. And if you buy something and you check out, you get 20% off across the board by putting in the code MP9135. That's MP9135 when you check out at Motion Pro. 20% off across the board on everything except custom cables, Keith. But anyway, yeah, Chris Carter. Actually, it kind of pertains to my next question. I mean, I've only had 2 other authors on the show. Chris Carter, who wrote the book When Honda Went Dirt Track Racing, and David Dewhurst, the Motocross, The Golden Era. Chris's book is, I have it here somewhere. It's huge. I mean, it's a really, really big book. It took him like 7 years to put together. And David Dewhurst, I know, spent several years as well. Dewhurst was in a little bit of a better position because he was a photographer, and most of the pictures in Motocross, the Golden Era, were taken by Dave Dewhurst. Chris Carter, not so much. My question to you is, how long did it take for you to write each of these books?
Roughly 2 years for each book.
Okay.
And you figure a year to year and a half preservation on both bikes. And when I sent my first manuscript off on Finding Number 49, that's when I started writing Jim's book on Discovering 6 Days. And so each one overall, with the preservation and the book release, you're looking at about 3.5 years.
You got the same publisher on both books?
No, since I was new to the game, I thought I'd try something different with the ISDT book. And I kind of self-published it through Ingram Spark, and they take less of a cut, even though I'm still in a hole on both books. It doesn't matter. It's the journey of meeting the people and telling their story and being able to be on a show like yours. It's something I always wanted to be involved with, the motorcycle industry. My college and my career field never led me there. It was always a hobby. So being able to contribute to the history of the sport is a very I'm kind of speechless.
Okay, well, you've made your point there. Who's in this picture with you, Keith?
So that's Jim. In 1977, he was sponsored by Cycle East. It was a mail order catalog motorcycle parts company, and he raced the Husqvarna that I have now, sponsored by Cycle East. He was on the same sponsored team as Dick Burleson.
Okay.
And he didn't quite qualify for the ISTT that year. One of the big roadblocks was he got a railroad spike through his rear rim while racing up in Washington. at a 2-day qualifier. But he still had the jersey and the helmet from 1977.
Wow. I started to talk to you a little bit earlier, just a couple of moments ago, and then I got involved with the plug for the sponsor, Motion Pro. But I forgot to ask you, you came out to the coast, you met with Chris Carter. What were some of the blanks that he filled in for you when it came to writing this book? Because he had a lot of success. He's a gold medal winner on a Yamaha.
So in 1974, Jim and Stan both rode for Rokon.
Mm-hmm.
Jim stayed with Rokon up until 76. Stan didn't care for the bike. He jumped over to Husqvarna in 74 and 75.
Mm-hmm.
In 76, he got a sponsored Yamaha ride. Not quite the sponsorship as Chris did, but similar bikes. And so that's another thing I wanted to ask Chris was more about the bikes and the development of the IT, since that was Stan's kind of sponsored ride for 76, and he got a silver medal on it in Austria.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to learn more about the development of the IT, because not only was Chris involved with it from a racing standpoint, Kevin Haggerty was involved with it from a design aspect of it. Kevin's history and how he was noticed by Yamaha is quite fascinating. It's spelled out in the book, but he was working for Gary Surdyk's Motorsports as a helper, mechanic, part manager, and then he went off to become a Yamaha field rep, where he was up in Wisconsin at a training facility. And at the time, Yamaha didn't offer like an IT version competitive enduro bike. You had your DT. Well, he took a MX250 and swapped out the crank to allow him to put a lighting coil and a DT flywheel on it. He added lights. He added a chain tensioner. And when the Yamaha engineers came to visit, that caught their eye, and they're asking who made this. And Kevin, they pushed him forward because they didn't know if he was going to be in trouble and he was praised. And from there, they're like, "You're going with us out to California on the IT project."
Okay.
And he did that. That led to becoming a manager of the ISDT team in 78, 79, and a long career in the industry.
Okay. We have a wonderful sponsor. I'm wearing the shirt, replicamotorcycleparts.com. Paul Parkinson Sr., an absolutely amazing man who's making so many different parts these days for so many different bikes. What you see here in the picture is a chain guide for a 1973-74 Honda CR250. I got to spend some time with Paul Parkinson Sr. up at the Can-Am reunion a couple of weeks ago. He's making some amazing products coming up, including gears, and he's talking about making a very rare and exotic special cylinder that a lot of people would be interested in. Get over to replicamotorcycleparts.com. Check out everything that's going on there with Paul Parkinson Sr. Thank you for being a sponsor, Paul. In the research that I do for my interviews or sometimes for restorations, there's always that moment where it's like, wow, I didn't know that. You've written 2 books. There had to be a couple of moments where it was like, I had no idea. What were some of the bigger ones for you, Keith?
Well, every discovery was, wow, I didn't know that. But when I first met Jim, and he pulled out his Mexico ISDT helmet, I'm like, Jim, you're a story in yourself here. And, the wheels started spinning. Dave Munganess, he's very well known in St. Louis and international 6-day riding. He already has a book out there on him. But I wanted to tell more of his story, because I learned that not only did he run a successful motorcycle dealership, he had off-road riding parks to allow his customers to go and ride. They break their bike, come back and fix it. And from 65 to 1980, he ran these off-road riding parks where the Pentons would show up and train. Honda engineers would do production testing on Honda Elsinores, first year Elsinores there. And it blew my mind thinking, oh my God, there was, that much center attention on this. What was nice about Mungenast's parks were they were private. He could close them for the day. Honda engineers can come in and do all the testing they want without being photographed or spied on. And that really blew my mind. So that was one thing I wanted to tell something about Dave, and so I wanted to focus on his parks that he provided to the public, which was pretty fascinating in itself.
Wasn't Mungenast the first Honda dealership in America? Well, for cars or motorcycles? Probably cars.
Closer to cars, because there was already a Honda dealership before Dave in St. Louis.
Right.
But I know I plug their family museum all the time. In the finding number 49, Ray, his son, let me show it at their museum. Ray, they recently moved the museum down about a half hour or so out of St. Louis, and it's called Classic Bike Headquarters. And right now, that's where Jim Simmons Husqvarna is at, if anybody wanted to see it. But there's hundreds of beautiful bikes there. Ray's doing the whole industry a service by putting that on.
Okay. And you mentioned Jack Penton a little while ago, too. I've had Jack on the show, fascinating guest. How did he contribute to your book, Keith?
Well, when I went out in 2019 and went to the Trailblazer banquet, that's when I first met the Pentons ever, when they were in the hotel lobby. And very welcoming, took pictures with me and my wife, and just great guys all around. Tom and Jeff, I mean, they're wanting to know about me. You know, I'm wanting to know about them. Yeah. And it was very nice of them. And so I added their photos to the book because they were part of my journey with this whole ISTT. You can't research ISTT without talking about the Pentons or learning more about them.
Exactly.
And luckily, I got to meet Jeff up at the I&M banquet back last September, about a year ago, and got a photo with him in the book. So.
You mentioned your children earlier and your beautiful wife. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about them, Keith, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what you do in your everyday life. But tell me again, how long are you married? How old are your children?
So Sarah's my wife. We've been together for 26 years, married for 18. We have our oldest son, or Rex is 8 and Eden is 6.
Yeah.
And
now, when you named him Rex, I'm guessing, what was that about?
No, that was before I found number 49.
Oh, so it had nothing to do with Rex Staten?
It did not, no.
Oh, okay.
But it did help me. It did help me as an excuse to go get the bike.
Hey, and in your everyday career, you are an engineer?
Yes, I work for Boeing. I do a lot of investigating and root cause corrective action. Troubleshooting on the factory floor, figuring out what's going on with parts or production, what's causing issues on the floor. So it really comes back to my writing. I'm investigating these bikes and looking for clues, and you kind of do the same thing, what I'm doing every day.
What type of riding do you still do, Keith? Riding, not writing, but motorcycle riding. What are you still interested in?
So like I said, I'm in a gap right now. Since the 2022 Daytona race, 2 months later, I did a vintage enduro on an XR 200.
Right.
I did that same enduro this past May. So that's, if you're keeping count, that's only one time of riding this year, off-road. I got a couple XR 200s I'm dabbling with in the garage. In the last 2 years, we moved back to our hometown and we built a house. So it's been pretty hectic. And I finally got a little bit of garage space that I can tinker on bikes with.
Right.
But I got a couple of Hondas I'll cruise around town on because it's a historic town. I like cruising up and catch people's eyes on my old Honda Scrambler or my Baby Dream. There's always a conversation there from somebody on the sidewalk.
Right.
But I'm trying to get my son into riding. We got a little Honda Grizzly next door at my in-laws that he likes to ride, 4-wheeler.
Jerry South.
So he's starting to be competitive on that, just following me around on the trails. So I'm hoping he gets the bug sooner or later, and we can go trail riding together.
We got one more commercial break, and then we'll be back to wrap it up with Keith Geisner. We'll be right back. Hey, it's Joe Abadi for Vintage Motocross Q&A. When you're replacing a cylinder or a gasket or doing a top end on your bike, many times it's very, very difficult to get to the nuts that are on the base. And you want to be sure that you torque those evenly whenever you change a top end. Motion Pro has come up with this great tool. It's the torque adapter, okay? You can put any size wrench in there and you can tighten it up. On the back is a 3/8 drive. You can put your torque wrench in there, get the wrench on the nut that's on the base of your cylinder, and make sure everything is torqued evenly. This is a great tool. I have one in the shop. We use it all the time. It comes with instructions as well. Go see your local dealer or get to motionpro.com. And don't forget, go over to Vintage Motocross Q&A to get a 20% discount on all Motion Pro tools. I thank my buddy Mike Chamberlain. Mike has become a supporter of Vintage Motocross Q&A. If you'd like to know more about helping out the show and you want to be a supporter, not necessarily a sponsor, get a hold of me and we'll put something together. I'd be happy to have you here. We have been speaking with Keith Geisner, the author of Finding Number 49 and, of course, Discovering 6 Days. Hey, Keith, tell me this. Where can I get this book? Where can I buy it?
You can buy it any online bookstore. Amazon's probably the easiest. There's copies on eBay, Walmart, anywhere online.
Right. Now, this book here, Finding Number 49, I went on eBay today and I saw they are selling for more than what you were selling them for originally.
Really? Well, that particular auction, I believe that book was signed by me and Rex Marcy. And if it's still available, that'd be a good buy for somebody. Rex Marcy was a designer for the MX team on the Harley. I'm really surprised it's still out there.
Well, it's got quite a following, and as I said, whether you're just a motocross guy or you're following that Harley motocross team, or you're a Harley enthusiast and you just want to expand your knowledge on that mark, Finding Number 49 is a great way to do it. Keith, is there anybody else you want to thank or anything that you're doing that you'd like to plug? Any races in your area? Anything you want to say right now? I'll give you a little floor space.
Well, thanks, Joe. I really want to thank you for, I guess, the last 3 or 4 years you've been promoting my book on a monthly giveaway, which I appreciate that dearly. Just all the great feedback I'm getting from the fans and supporters of your show and vintage motocross in general. Yeah. I'm just glad I'm able to give back and have my foot in the door for something in the motorcycle industry. It's been a hell of a ride, and hopefully it keeps going.
Keith Geisner, thank you for being my guest. Don't disconnect, Keith. Stay there. I'm going to go to full screen. I got a couple of more things to do, but don't disconnect. Thank you for being my guest tonight. Keith Geisner, get out and get yourself a copy of Discovering 6 Days or that fabulous Finding Number 49. Keith, thanks so much.
Thank you, Joe.
We'll see you next time. Geisner, a fabulous guest with some interesting stories. You know, we can only cover so much about Discovering 6 Days and Finding Number 49, but they're both great books, and I would highly recommend them. A lot of people have purchased them, and nobody's been disappointed so far, and I can tell you, you won't be either. Don't forget to support our sponsors. One of them, RacerX, racerx.com, one of the finest publications on your newsstand and now. If you want to become a Vintage Motocross Q&A sponsor, get a hold of me. I'll get you a sponsorship opportunity package. Don't forget, we've got t-shirts still available. Vintage Motocross Q&A t-shirts and hoodies in both gray and white. Get one today, just $19.99. Follow the link in the show description. Got some great events coming up too. My buddy George Ackerman down in Ruther Glen, Virginia, having an open house on October 28th. Get a hold of George. He wants to make sure he has enough food and drink for everybody. I will be there along with Warren Reed, Steve Wise, Don Kadalski, Gary Bailey, Martina Faltova-Cope, and I think there's going to be a few more guests there as well. Hot off the press, just came in from Scott Burnworth. October 1st, Carlsbad reunion. That will be at Bruise Brothers. That's in beautiful San Diego. That's happening October 1st. There'll be riders there, fans, just MX legends, a bike show. Every year, it's absolutely a fantastic event. So mark your calendar, October 1st. And I think around October 27th, too, Scott Burnworth has a race coming up. He usually does that at Glen Helen, I think it is. Sometimes it's Verona Oaks. Anyway, that about wraps it up for this week's edition of Vintage Motocross Q&A. I want to thank Keith Geisner, thank all my sponsors, and thank you, the viewers at home who tune in every week. I'll try to get him. I don't know. Let me see. Gino! I don't know. When I do the interviews, he gets a little taken back. You know, Gino! Oh, I think he's coming. Hang on. Gino! Come here, Gino. Come on, boy. There you go. Okay. Everybody's happy now. Gino's here. That's it for Vintage Motocross Q&A. We will see you next time. Thank you again, Keith Geisner.
Thank you, Joe. Take care, buddy.